Let's start. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matteo Vergani, and I am Senior Research Fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute at Deakin University, and I am a member of the Center for Resilient and Inclusive Societies, or CRIS, as we call it, which is hosting the webinar today. So on behalf of CRIS, I'd like to welcome you all to this very important discussion towards a national system for classifying and recording hate crimes in Australia. Firstly, however, I would like to acknowledge that we are all calling from a range of traditional lands from around Australia. I am here on Boon Wurrung country in the Kulin Nation. So I would like to acknowledge my gratitude that we share this land today and my sorrow for some of the costs of sharing, and my hope and belief that we can move to a place of equity, justice, and partnership together. Today, the discussion will be about hate crime data collection. So if you want to read some background information about the extent of the problem, hate crime definitions, legislations, I suggest you to visit the new website, www.tacklinghate.org. The creation of the website was supported by the Victorian Department of Justice and Community Safety, and it's sustained in collaboration with CRIS. Just before I introduce our speakers, I quickly want to outline how the webinar will run. So first, we have a conversation with the speakers. Then, depending on time, we'd like to have a Q&A where everyone will have the opportunity to ask some questions. You will see the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. Please use this to ask your questions. You will also be able to use the chat function. However, if you ask a question in the chat, we may unintentionally miss the question because it will be pushed up in the chat discussion. So please use the Q&A button for your questions to the speakers. We have a fantastic lineup today. I'd like to welcome our speakers. With us today, we have Senator the Honorable Kristina Keneally, Senator for New South Wales, Deputy Labour Leader in the Senate, Shadow Minister for Home Affairs, and Shadow Minister for Immigration and Citizenship. Kristina is the 42nd Premier of New South Wales from 2009 to 2011, and the first woman to hold the office. Let me say that if we want to improve Australia's ability to tackle hate crime effectively, we need strong political commitment. And it's so important to have you with us today, Kristina. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Matteo.
With us today, we have Assistant Commissioner Luke Cornelius, APM, from Victoria Police. He was awarded the Australian Police Medal for contribution to police reform, the promotion of ethics and integrity in policing, human rights, engagement with vulnerable communities. And all of these is so relevant to our discussion today. So if we want to set up a national hate crime database, police is the most important stakeholder, and we need to understand how solutions look like from the police perspective. So thank you for joining us, Luke.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks. With us today, we have Race Commissioner Chin Tan from the Australian Human Rights Commission. Chin Tan commenced his term as a Race Discrimination Commissioner on October 8, 2018. Chin was the chairperson and statutory head of the Victorian Multicultural Commission from 2011 to 2015. The Australian Human Rights Commission is certainly leading the discussion about setting up a national database. And we are really eager to hear your views, Chin, about the way forward to create this national hate crime database and lead the discussion. Thank you for being with us, Chin.
Good to be here, Matthew.
Thanks. I'm sure many of you noticed that today we do not have speakers from communities. Communities are a key stakeholder in the field of hate crime data collection. We know well the fundamental role that communities play. But at the same time, in this specific webinar, we decided to focus on understanding government's perspectives in depth. For this reason, only for today, we did not invite community representatives. We will surely follow up with more public discussion and engagement with community stakeholders on this very topic and between communities and government. But today, we want to dive into understanding barriers and solutions from government perspectives. In a nutshell, for this webinar, we privileged depth over breadth. So without further ado, let's get started with our discussion. So hate crime refers to any criminal offense motivated by bias towards an outgroup. One of the main reasons why a centralized repository of hate crime data does not exist is that there are different legislative frameworks across different states, and there is no common definition of hate crime throughout the country. In Victoria, they are referred to as prejudice-motivated crimes, in New South Wales as bias crimes. So let's start with Chin. Chin, can you help us to understand what are the roles and divisions of responsibilities and legislations between federal, state, and local governments and agencies in terms of addressing hate crime and hate incidents?
Great. Thanks, Matteo. And you're right in saying that federation, whatever its merit might be, and I'm a big fan of federation, is in this instance, on this subject matter, a barrier to centralized reporting of hate and prejudice. In Australia, we have 9 different jurisdictions, and each one has its own legal framework, its own police force, its own lawmakers, its own human rights agencies. I mean, for instance, under my act, which is the Racial Discrimination Act, and other pieces of legislation, it deals with prejudice and a whole range of other matters, which in itself would be a big challenge and a great deal of complexity to try and overcome. So the coverage of a range of offenses and the empowerment of the commission with certain judicial responsibilities add to that complexity. We receive complaints about racism and other forms of prejudice from the public, which we then obviously seek to collate as much information as possible. But alongside all of that, Matteo, each state and each territory has its own articles of legislation and with its own human rights organization. And most of these organizations collect data about hate, prejudice, and racial discrimination. So each state has its own police service, its own enforcement set of rules and laws and different standards for how it records information. So there's a kind of fragmentation of responsibility and standards. And there are certainly ways for the different jurisdictions to share the information they collect, but then there are barriers that need to be overcome in order for that to happen in the most effective way. I mean, I'm committed in my role to ensuring that we start a conversation about having some capacity to get to an effective outcome of having effective ways of collecting this information. So the definitions that you mentioned of hate crimes and reportable race incidents, again, is another gray area. There is no consistency in how each jurisdiction defines the various offenses under race discrimination legislation. So this means that a consistent approach in dealing with hate and race-based incidents is very difficult across jurisdictions. As I indicated, at the state and federal level, jurisdictions have different type of anti-discrimination legislation, but the level of coverage is not consistent nationally. Example, on the state of New South Wales, there has been court cases where religious vilification has occurred and was demonstrated in the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal in the case, for example, of Actor Maui versus 9 Network Australia, where religious vilification was found to exist, but because it wasn't covered by New South Wales legislation, no action was taken. So this creates a system where the level of protection you receive is dependent on the jurisdictions in which you reside and the jurisdiction in which the incidents occurs. And it's also unfortunate, Matteo, that as well in relation to crimes that are deemed to be hate crimes, for example, section 20.2 capital A of the Criminal Code 1995. It states that an individual can receive up to 7 years imprisonment if they commit an offense that urges or incite violence against a group that is distinguished by race, religion, nationality, or political opinion. That unfortunately, that hate aspects of these crimes or the intention or motivation behind these crimes is often treated secondary to the criminal activity or action. And this is due to many factors, including the difficulty of proving intention and the lower penalty units that often attract to this sort of crimes. And it also means that the hate aspect is not pursued and at times not recorded. So the recording and collection of hate incident data, it's something that we've been advocating, and we believe, as you had mentioned, the services at the forefront of this to make hate crimes data collection work with the police services as well. And I also finished up quickly that reporting remains an area of concern nationally, with the patchwork of legislation offering different definitions and standards of hate crime. And so it's nearly impossible to centrally compare data and trends, even if the data was being collected, which it is not. And I think that's why it's important that the chief lawmakers, the police chief in each state and territory are brought into the conversation as early as possible. And I've written to each police chief, by the way, asking about their systems and processes for recording information about racism. And of those who have responded, it is very clear to us that the very different systems operate in each state. So if I want to encapsulate that, Matteo, in a nutshell, there has to be, number one, consistency in the definition of hate crimes, racial discrimination, and reportable racial incidents. Number two, consistency in the treatment and sanctions that apply to such crimes or incidents. Thirdly, recognition of these crimes as standalone and capable of being enforced in their own rights and not reliant or subservient to other criminal acts in order to succeed. And then next point is to understand and to have an agreement on the classification and levels of hate of race incidents that are deemed reportable. Next, uniform standards and classification in the receiving, recording, and reporting race-based or hate crimes or incidents. That we need a unified system of analyzing data so we know what we're talking about and we're talking and speaking the same language. And we need to establish a regime of mandatory reporting of data based on crimes, incidents. And lastly, data that's capable of being universally and freely shared with relevant stakeholders. And I want to finish with this obviously message, which I felt is important to emphasize, Matteo, to our audience and to the community at large. And I want to close by emphasizing that while we are arguing passionately for a much needed hate database collection and sharing capability, we must not forget that at the end of each hate or racial abuse or discrimination is a person who is a victim, and that our quest for better data collection should be dedicated to ensuring, at the very least, that victims of abuse and hate should expect that their experience should be and will be recorded, counted, and considered. That every victim of hate and racial abuse and discrimination deserve to have their voice heard and experience recognized and taken seriously.
Thank you, Chin. You outlined very well the problems, and let's go and ask Kristina. We understood from Chin the problems. So what can the federal government do to address all these issues? So, for example, one of the questions that came also from the public now is that, yes, there are some issues in terrorism legislations and consistency across different jurisdictions, but states found some effective mechanisms to work together. So what can the federal government do to make this happen in the hate crime space?
Thanks, Matteo. And I might pick up where Chin ended with the reminder that at the end of every act of racial hate, or hate full stop, whether it's directed at a person based on their race, religion, gender, ability or disability, or the like, at the end of that is a person who is a real victim. And I think it reminds us that the fluid boundaries between hate crime and more serious violence means that this is a problem we can't afford to ignore. I would like to reflect upon Chin's predecessor, Tim Supamasane, who you said that hate speech leads to political violence if you allow it to escalate. And the Christchurch events last year, which involved an Australian white supremacist, also demonstrate to us where that hate can lead and why we need to act as a society and as a government, a parliament and a government. But I think Chin's point about definitions is an important one, and one we need to acknowledge, because defining the key issues in the definitions will be fundamental to getting the federal parliament to consider this in the context of legislation. So, I think we need a conversation in Australia like the one we're having today on what constitutes a hate crime or incident, and in turn that allows us to quantify the extent of the problem, arguing for whether it's legislation or policy to address the issue becomes far more feasible. Unfortunately, we have a long way to go on this in Australia. We haven't even had a serious national conversation about how the Christchurch shooter was radicalized. And how much of that radicalization occurred in Australia. It's hard to see how, it's not hard to see that some of Brendan Tarrant's ugly path was shaped by conversations and ideas in mainstream Australia. And, no debate about hate crimes or their prevalence should ignore that. But I think if we want to take action on racism, on hate crimes, that is something that my party, the Labour Party, has been, of which we've been wholly supportive. And in fact, I would, just observe we've been the driving force behind the majority of federal legislation in recent decades. But I want to turn to what the solutions might be here. I think most people would agree that putting some metrics around the problem will help develop the impetus for legislative and policy change. It seems that there is anecdotal evidence, for example, that during COVID-19 we are seeing an increase in hate incidents, but we have no actual data to help back that up on a nationwide platform. And I know that state and federal agencies at various places collect various types of data. Many community groups do, but we don't put that together anywhere to form a cohesive national picture. And that's a complex issue. I'll just leave that there for a minute and talk about legislation. But I think it is important to acknowledge that definitional issues and that comprehensive data collection are fundamentally important. Now, Chin talked about the responsibilities across state and federal jurisdictions. I do want to specifically talk about federal legislation. Now, there is an undeniable argument that a national law would allow for greater consistency in application across jurisdictions. It would give all Australians equal protection under the law. Those examples Chin pointed out are real, and a consistent national piece of legislation would go a long way to addressing those. Now, many other countries do have this in place: Canada, the UK, New Zealand, Germany, France, just to name a few. So there are examples we can look at. I would also say that federal legislation can be a great way to express a national commitment, a national set of values. For example, Australia's 1975 Federal Racial Discrimination Act was a breakthrough in race relations. What it really did was, in terms of legislatively did, it reflected ratification by Australia on the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. But as the Prime Minister of the day, Gough Whitlam, said, it was a historic measure. it entrenched new attitudes of tolerance and understanding in the hearts and minds of the people. So a federal law can do many things, and as a statement of our national commitment and our national values, it would be an incredibly important tool. However, and this is the however part, I think as most people on this webinar will know, making changes to federal legislation is not a simple task, and particularly in this area, getting broad agreement on definitions will be difficult. This debate is highly charged, and the issues are extremely contentious. There is political polarization at this time. There is a lack of consensus on what speech should be and should not be unlawful. And even the term hate speech creates some confusion and debate. So I think it's important to note that further legislation, while would be useful, may be hard to achieve, and it may ultimately not be the fix that we are after. Europe, for example, has some of the most comprehensive hate speech laws in the world, but that has not prevented the rise of hateful discourse and violence there. So we should also look at what legislation we do have. The scope and the content of hate crime legislation varies, as Chin has so eloquently pointed out, across the state and territory jurisdictions. And while there are gaps, there's also a lot of evidence to suggest that the legislation that does exist is underutilized. As we heard, there are many crimes that could be prosecuted as hate crimes that are not, often because it's simpler to use another law as a simpler route to conviction. I'll end on this point. When it comes to federal legislation, while it will have its benefits, while it should be feasible, but would be a hard road to get, and while it would help address some of those gaps that do exist, it will not in and of itself abolish racist attitudes. And we need to combine any legislation, and I know we'll get to this, Matteo, with hard, honest assessments about the problem and the sustained public education that's needed to bring about changes in attitudes, and both in terms of individuals and institutional attitudes. And I think that this would ensure that the existing laws, as well as any new legislation, could be used most effectively.
Thank you, Kristina. Actually, talking about the legislation that we do have, let's try to understand from Luke, what are the different approaches that police use to operationalize this legislation to collect data about prejudice or bias-motivated crime? What are the best practices we have in Australian states, and how can we replicate them?
Yeah, thanks, Matteo. Just in beginning, I acknowledge that I speak to you from the land of the traditional owners, the people of the Kulin Nations, and in particular the Wurundjeri, which are in the patch that I police, which is the northwest of metropolitan Melbourne. Can I just begin by first noting that, of course, the approaches taken by police in jurisdictions in this space are very much informed by the legislation that operates in their respective jurisdictions. And the other speakers have already touched on significant differences, but also similarities across jurisdictions in relation to how criminal conduct in this context is characterised, defined, described. So in Victoria, our specific legislation speaks to prejudice motivated crime, and in particular it's directed towards conduct harms which are motivated by prejudice grounded in either race or religion. We have for some time had specific legislation in this space in Victoria, and I'd be the first to acknowledge, as has been identified by Kristina, that on the face of it, the legislation certainly appears to be underutilised. There are very small numbers of prosecutions under this legislation. And from our perspective here in Victoria, that is very much a reflection of the challenges associated with proving intent in relation to these specific provisions. I'd also make the observation that here in Victoria, we do absolutely focus on capturing modus operandi information in relation to cohort, or if you like, more traditional criminal offences, which have as an aspect of the offending a component that involves hate-based or prejudice-motivated crime. And what we do is we will charge the assault, we will charge the other criminal offences, but put before the court as an aggravating factor the prejudice-motivated aspect, so that the court can take that into account if upon conviction, take that into account when determining sentence as an aggravating factor. So here in Victoria, we capture data not only in relation to the small number of matters that we bring before the courts under the prejudice motivated crime legislation, but also in relation to crime more generally. So we in Victoria do collect data, not just in relation to the specific legislation, but also in relation to crimes that are committed more generally. And I recently shared that data with a parliamentary inquiry that was conducted down here in Victoria a couple of weeks ago. I would also, though, looking at that data, be the first to acknowledge that while we capture that data, our ability to capture it is very much dependent on our people, our police, making sure that they do in fact appropriately characterise the conduct and make sure that prejudice motivated crime is characterised as it should be and is documented in our online reporting systems. And when I look at that data, it is very clear to me, and when I line that up with feedback that I get across community, it is very clear that there remains significant underreporting of prejudice motivated crime across our community. And we think there are a number of factors driving that. One is a lack of appreciation across the community that prejudice motivated crime is unlawful and will be taken seriously by police and thoroughly investigated. The other is a lack of appreciation on the part of police that we should, where prejudice, evidence of prejudice is available, it should be properly characterised and reported and appropriate charges brought. But the other piece is we are victim-led, and there are many victims in this space who are very reluctant to play what they call the race card. And so instead they would prefer a prosecution if say a charges of an assault are open, they would prefer proceedings to be brought in those terms. We of course take the time working with victims to apprise them of the options and of course assure them of our support in terms of whatever pathway they would prefer. But I'd make the point that we do have a particular focus here in Victoria on being victim-led and making sure that the wishes of the victim are taken into account in relation to the prosecution pathway that we ultimately adopt when we bring matters to the court. But even if we are pursuing a prosecution under, if you like, a more traditional offence, where we've got the evidence of the prejudice as an aggravating factor, we absolutely do make a point of putting that before the court. So that gives you a bit of a sense of the approach here in Victoria. Of course, the approach taken by other policing jurisdictions is very much a reflection of their own legislative framework and their policies and what their community is saying to them about the approach that they want their police force to take. So I think that by and large explains why you see such a differential approach and also practice across policing jurisdictions. But I would point to some solutions around systematisation and consistency in reporting, and that does go to the fact that crime reporting and crime statistics are subject to national counting rules, for want of a better description, that are settled by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And there's certainly an opportunity for us through the policing jurisdictions to engage with the ABS in relation to generating some national standards in relation to reporting of prejudice motivated crime, notwithstanding differences in legislation. I mean, we see differences in legislation across many crime types, but nonetheless, we've still been able to come up with consistent national accounting rules and reporting standards. And I can see no reason why we could not achieve that same level of consistency and reporting standards in relation to prejudice motivated crime.
Thank you, Luke. Just want to remind everyone that if they want to add some question to the Q&A using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, they can, and we will try to get to them throughout the discussion. So let's talk about an important topic in relation to creating a national database, which is sharing data. Sharing data between different government agencies, sharing data between researchers, for example, and government agencies. We know, for example, that government agencies do not have the time for blue sky thinking or for conducting research on causes and protective and risk factors of hate crime, which is crucial to underpin policy, programming, evaluation. Academics are very eager to conduct research, but they do not have access to the data. So how can we bridge the gap? What are the barriers that prevent government agencies to share data between them and with other civil society organizations? And how can we tackle or dismantle these barriers? Chin, what is the perspective of a human rights agency on this?
But, I don't think, if you're looking at the perspective, Matteo, from university wanting information, let's say from Human Rights Commissions, I don't think there's any known barrier that I can think of in terms of agencies like ours sharing data with researchers. If there are, I don't think it's insurmountable. I think it's about making sure that we obviously comply with requirements of privacy and confidentiality. We do publish, for example, the Commission, and I suspect state agencies do the same, complaints data about racism and all the other protected attributes in this annual report. So it's something that's already out there. As to the possibility of asking for detailed information, I suspect that's more of an issue of logistics and resourcing about the depth and volume of information that may be requested. And obviously, it's also asking from the agency for information that it might have, because to be fair, agencies only collect information that pertains to complaints within a very, very specialized area of race discrimination, not even hate crimes. And it's sort of question about information collection is really based on a culture of saying, what do we collect and how do we collect it and why do we share this? And it's not mandated. There is no real encouragement to do any of that. And so principally, there isn't that capacity for that free flowing of information and the need to be able to make those information available. So there's nothing mandated. There's no central agency that compels us to have those information made available to them. So ideally, the sort of information we're talking about should be centrally located and it should be recorded. And this is what we're arguing for. Important to note that previously, Australia, as far as I'm aware, did not nationally collect data on domestic violence as such. But I understand as it is currently and exists, there are processes in place where these information are now recorded and reported. So it can be done. And hate crimes and race-based incidents should be recognized for the scourge it is on our community. And as such, data collection should be accorded equal attention and priority. And furthermore, agencies should in some ways be mandated to comply with requirements of having information made available and collected in a central basis. So to the question that you've asked about these barriers in collecting data, I would say that resourcing and political will, something picked up by the senator, are key to making this happen. I think one of the relevant significance of the effects of COVID-19 pandemic crisis is that it's put race hate and race-based incidents in particular into the forefront of public discourse. And hopefully this will result in strengthening the political will towards better data collection and sharing. And if I could, Matthew, just slightly off tangent, but picking up on what Luke Cornelius have said, is the fact that I think it's important, and my advocacy has been that we need to be able to strengthen hate crimes laws in this country. We need to have legislation that will call the crime by its name. Previously, it wasn't a domestic violence legislation, it was an assault on someone in the house. But we've grown up, we've become better able to recognize serious issues about what these things do and crime that revolves around hate and violence. And therefore, we're calling it by name. And I think it's important to legislation that does that. And it's ironic, and hearing from what Luke had said, and it's not a problem with police, it's probably about getting it right in terms of the legislation area and the whole culture. And when you have an incident that comes up, Matthew, from, let's say, a race rally when it was ostensibly organized on the basis of race hate, and then when you have assault or criminal activities that transpired, well, it wasn't those assault and criminal activities that are the primary object of the purpose of the gathering. It was hate. So it's important to recognize the need to be able to identify, to be able to define properly what we're talking about by hate crime. So there should be a hate crime for what it is, based principally on what it is, and it goes to court on the very basis of which it's been described as a hate crime. And when people are in fact locked away, it wasn't because of assault, but because of hate crime. And I think it's about that conversation we need to have at saying, how seriously do we regard that this is an important area for national discourse about making sure that we don't tolerate or in any way allow hate to grow in our society.
Thank you, Chin. Look, picking up actually on this, I would like to ask a question to Luke in relation to still the barriers that prevent data sharing, but I also merge a question coming from the audience, which is in relation to partnerships between police and communities in data collection. So I know that there have been small trials in Victoria of collaboration or partnership between Victoria Police and Victorian Human Rights Commission. And overseas, we have seen, for example, I'm thinking about the True Vision system in the UK, collaboration and data sharing between two ways, actually, not one way, between police and some communities. Is this possible in Australia? And what do you think are the barriers to do more data sharing for Victoria Police?
Thanks, Matteo. And I note the question on the chat as well. Look, I would begin first by talking about the role of Victoria Police within the context of other state agencies in partnership with community. So VERIOC absolutely has a key role and takes an active role certainly in the civil jurisdiction, but also in the criminal jurisdiction in relation to referring matters which are reported to VERIOC to us, particularly if there's criminal conduct involved. And we do have a standing MOU with VERIOC, which supports information sharing and cross-referral of incidents. So we will refer matters to VERIOC where if it's been reported to us initially as a criminal matter and we recognise instead that it's a civil matter, we'll refer it to VERIOC and vice versa. So we certainly share information on an ongoing basis with VERIOC. That MOU is subject to review at the moment and we're looking to renew that MOU. It's been in place for the last 3 years, and that certainly provided a useful framework within which both VERIOC and VicPol have been able to share information and also generate a shared view about the prevalence and impact, based on the reports that we've received, the prevalence and impact of prejudice motivated crime in our community. But both ourselves and also VERIOC have told me that we continue to be challenged by significant underreporting, which brings me to the second point I want to make, and that is the traditional approach to reporting crime to police is that you need a victim and it's on the victim to make the report. Now, of course, we recognise that there are a whole range of barriers to victims coming forward to police, particularly if those individuals have come from communities elsewhere where the relationship for police has not been a relationship grounded in trust or grounded in respect, and in fact have come from places where police have been oppressors. And so one of the key challenges for us has been to help communities to understand that in fact we are here to stand with them and for them. And so one of the things that we have certainly looked to encourage is third-party reporting. So that is community-based organisations and advocacy groups may come to us with a victim and walk alongside that victim and advocate with the victim for police to conduct an investigation and hold a perpetrator to account. Now, I have to say, there's been a lot of goodwill in this space, and we have certainly been prepared to work with third-party reporters, so long as there's a victim standing there as well, and to work with advocacy groups in support of victims who have experienced prejudice-motivated crime. But I have to say to you, Matteo, and everyone, again, notwithstanding us engaging with community representative organisations about our preparedness to be open to that approach, again, we're seeing very low numbers. So, for example, within the context of the COVID emergency at the moment, we're aware of increased prejudice, motivated crime, incidents and criminal offences being directed towards Australians of Asian background. The actual number of individual victims coming to us, whether on their own or with the assistance of community-based organisations, remains very, very low. Certainly where individuals have come to us with, for example, mobile phone footage and very clear evidence, we have been able to take action. But even there, Matteo, people coming to us in no way reflects our understanding of what we believe to be the true scale of the prevalence of prejudice-motivated crime in our community. So the key point I would make there is that we have a long way to go in helping individuals within communities appreciate that we in policing are there for them, and we will stand alongside them and stand up for them when they're facing the brunt of this outrageous behaviour.
Thank you, Luke. I would like to ask you a follow-up question, Luke, because we are getting a lot of questions from the audience in relation to hate speech and other incidents that are not criminal. So what can police do when they receive a complaint for an incident that is not regulated or protected by criminal law? And will police collect this data?
So I will be as frank as I can be without disclosing too much about our playbook, but I will say this: we take every opportunity we can, if we become aware that a hate speaker is coming into our jurisdiction, to pull every available lever available to us to prevent that hate speaker from having a platform. So, for example, if it involves an individual coming to us from overseas, we will make active representations to ensure that a visa is not granted. If notwithstanding those efforts, an individual is granted from overseas a visa to come and speak in our jurisdiction, then we will follow very closely what is said. If we identify that breaches of the prejudice-motivated legislation, particularly under the Religious and Racial Tolerance Act, are committed, we'll again take action. And we also rely on the full range of other powers that are available to us, where hate speech might cause a breach of peace, for example. We will take action there. In relation to the powers we have here in Victoria, things have to get pretty proximate before we can take action, but we certainly do have a track record of taking action at the earliest opportunity to prevent hate speakers from getting the podium and being in a position to incite violence and unrest and harm in our community.
Thank you, Luke. Kristina, what can a federal government do to address non-criminal hateful behavior like racism, hate speech, discrimination?
Yeah, thank you. And look, I've been finding it really interesting to listen here to the other two speakers. But you know, I think it's worth us just acknowledging that our current social cohesion and national unity is not something we should take for granted. You know, if COVID shows us anything, it's that the world can change quite suddenly. And in a context like COVID, where, as we've all acknowledged, we have seen a rise in incidents, in propagandizing, in frustration and in hate, we need to show consistent and unfailing leadership at a federal level to stand up for diversity, including through a zero tolerance approach to racism and non-criminal hateful behaviors. I think this is really important at a federal level because we set the tone for the national conversation around these issues. And we talked about legislative issues, but if I can just also talk about some of the other ways the federal government can play a role, particularly around racism, hate speech, discrimination, and other non-criminal hateful behaviors. The two things I want to focus on are, as I said, leadership and messaging and a national anti-racism strategy. That leadership, it has to be proactive. By that I mean, we can't be silent. We can't allow vacuums to develop that can legitimize views or legitimize people who want to sow discord and racism in our community, and acknowledge what has been said in terms of the Victorian police being willing to stand up when someone is coming from overseas. That's an incredibly important message that we're not going to allow people to come in and legitimize that type of language and attitudes. And whilst I think of it this way, and it's not Malcolm Turnbull's own quote, but he often used to say, the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. And so it's about not walking past those views that we reject without saying something. And forgive me, I'm a politician. I'm going to be political for a moment, but I just want to note, my counterpart, Minister Dutton, he does a regular talk back spot on a radio station, and he, in my view, too often sits there quietly while the host of that particular program will make an offhanded comment. So for example, in the thick of the COVID pandemic in April, the host said, and I quote, "Toyota Hilux's vans being driven by Asians chock-a-block full of toilet paper." Now, the Minister for Home Affairs did not call out those comments. He sat there quietly. He didn't offer any pushback or rebuke of that language. And that's not leadership, that's enabling behavior. It allows racism, whether it's casual or purposeful, to take hold in people's minds. And it's to the detriment of Australia and all Australians alike. A useful point of comparison is the effort and the priority that the government places on bikie gangs. There's regular statements on the matter, report after report on this problem that comes out of agencies. There's also significant Australian federal police work underway. Now, let me be clear that the crimes committed by bikie gangs are reprehensible. And this action that the federal government and state governments do in coordination is justified. But I would also argue that right-wing extremism is reprehensible. And unfortunately, we don't have that same level of effort. I would argue that right-wing extremism requires similar national leadership on tackling those views, on that hatred, and on those on those organizations. So I think leaders have a responsibility to call out behavior as we see it. We need to value the fact that Australia is the world's most successful multicultural nation on earth, and acknowledge that the vast majority of Australians do abhor racism, but that means we can't ignore it, and we can't fail to take a stand when it's clearly a growing issue. You know, and sadly, again, you know, we saw another example this week with Andrew Bolt's recent column arguing that multiculturalism and diversity is what have made Victorians vulnerable to coronavirus. That's short-sighted, it's insidious messaging, and it just seeks to foment hatred and foster division in our society. And again, it's about legitimizing that view. You know, and so it wasn't called out as strong as it could have been, or in many cases at all, by the nation's leadership. And it's statements like that embolden views of people on the street who think it's okay to single out particular members of the community. And to that end, you know, I would say that media organizations have a responsibility to consider the views that they publish as well, and what the impact of those views are. So I also heard from a community group just this week on how we're failing to understand how much those kinds of views and other white supremacist activity is affecting minority communities, that because it chips away at that social cohesion. It undermines trust in authorities. It undermines people's ability to feel safe in the community, on public transport, in the shops. That's an insidious and unhelpful effect of those kinds of views. So, you know, in the Senate, we can do things as we did earlier this year about clear and bipartisan statements on the persistent reports of racial discrimination aimed at Chinese and other Asian backgrounds since the COVID outbreak. You can condemn it in the strongest possible terms, and you know, that's good, and I think it's useful that the Senate and the Parliament do those sorts of things, but that's got to be backed up by other steps by the federal government, things like an anti-racism national strategy, which is something that, you know, we haven't had since 2011 in Australia. And so we need to see that strategy as a key element of addressing this problem outside of proposed legislation. I think it's unacceptable. The Labor Party thinks it's unacceptable that we are currently without such a strategy, especially given what's going on in the community and what communities are telling us about the demonstrated need for such an initiative. So if I think about that strategy we had in 2011, you know, it was focused on public education and awareness, and particularly on young people. And I think when we think about things like right-wing extremism, you know, the government can have all the de-radicalization programs that it wants, but it's undeniable that it is far simpler to stop somebody going down the path of radicalization than it is to de-radicalize them later on. And so it's about, you know, communicating, reinforcing the values of our country and our society, that we are against racism, that we are against hate, we are against division. I think two, it is about educating and raising awareness amongst parents, youth groups, schools, churches, sporting organizations, that this is happening with our young people online. You know, we have increased screen time now during COVID, that this is happening, and what those adults in a young person's life, what they should be alive to, what they should be looking out for, and how they can helpfully intervene, and when they should, and where help can be found as well. So, you know, I think there's quite a range of things we could be doing, in addition to legislation. So I think there are leadership, an anti-racism national strategy, and better public education and assistance for communities are some important steps that a federal government can take.
Thank you, Kristina. You talked about so many different layers. I would like to follow up with Chin and merging a couple of points that Kristina made. Let's talk about, you know, the political level and also the institutional level, the systemic racism that some communities experience, thinking about the Aboriginal community among others, and also the level, the role that the media play in this. So what can we do, and what do you think, Chin, we should tackle and address this level of hate coming from systemic and from the media?
Matthew, how much time do you have?
5 minutes.
There are at least 6 issues in that one question, but it all boils down to obviously that one principle about, and Kristina has stated very well, as Sandra has mentioned, about leadership. It's terribly important. When racism happens, it's not what the one person does to the next person, it's what the rest of us do that equally matters, because it gives comfort and protection to the victim in knowing that it's a system that protects them when something like hate occurs, and where there is silence and where no one is taking that outrage, it becomes a problem. And I'll give you an example. I mean, the recent, I suppose the uptick in anti-Chinese or anti-Asian racism, when a Asian Australian has been targeted and being abused out there, I wonder what's the reaction of the rest of Australia, who might not have been there, who wasn't witnessed it, wasn't a bystander. When we have our conversations in our dining table with our family or among friends in the pub, what do we say to ourselves? And is there a sense of outrage that this is happening in our country? And that, for me, underpins awareness and education about why we collectively have to take responsibility. It's not a process. It's the practice at the ground level, and it's always personal. Racism is about a personal issue or one person being the victim in the circumstances. So I think it's important to understand that. Oh, there's a professor, and I can mention that, Keneally Nui from the Wesleyan University, who said racism is a structure, not an event. So it's not an act itself. It's that collective sense of where we allow things to happen and say it's okay. Well, it's not okay. So in terms of the layering, it's terribly important. You mentioned the media. I've had a project I've been running for about a year about sharing the stories of Muslim Australians. And constantly, the communities I go to, from Perth all the way up to Darwin, to the south, it's about the media reporting and the way they have been, caricatured and the way they have been painted in terms of the Muslim community in the eyes of the media and to the community, and projection that creates anxiety for them. That's an important element about where we get it right in terms of community. The leadership is important, but it's a leadership in all the different sectors, and it's all holistic. Every layer has to play a role. Institutional racism is there, whether we like it or not. There's the Asian Australian clamoring for an opportunity to be involved in the leadership areas of our community, which they've been missing. And we had reports that have been done, my predecessor, Tim Supomasan, that indicates that lack of capacity to participate at the higher level of our community. And these are important aspects of where we need to dismantle that thinking about how we approach things differently. It's a cultural change, but Matthew, to be fair, it's also about bringing awareness, because a lot of people sometimes don't understand. There's a lot of that innate prejudice that we all have in some elements of saying we need to wake people up to the realization. And the greatest pleasure I have is when someone says, well, Chin, I didn't see it that way before. Well, now they do. And it's opening people's understanding of where race and racism, race hate hurts people, and how they can make changes constructively to bring about a better outcome.
Thank you, Chin. We have a interesting question for Luke. what effort have been made to engage with technology companies in relation to deplatforming on online platforms? So have law enforcement run into any issues in attempting to engage with tech companies on the issue of hate speech online?
Yeah, thanks, Matteo. We do through our media corporate comms department, which is our outward-facing contact with media, including social media. We certainly do take the occasion to reach out to Twitter, reach out to Facebook and other social media platforms where prejudice-motivated speech has been published on those sites in our jurisdictions. We take the opportunity to call it out with those entities and encourage them to take that material down. Much depends, of course, on where it's published. Much also depends, of course, on the fact that as a state-based agency, we don't have any regulatory authority in relation to the provision of communication services. So if we find that that offending is committed by an individual based within our jurisdiction, or they're publishing that material in our jurisdiction and it is directed towards causing harm to people in our community, then we will take action to address it. And we've certainly had occasion where those commercial entities have acquiesced and taken steps to take the material down. One of the challenges, though, that we face, and this was certainly true with the Christchurch outrage, was that notwithstanding the fact that when ultimately Facebook did take that live stream video down, it had already gone viral and it was out in the wild and it was being picked up and republished in a whole range of contexts. So, you know, I have to say the effectiveness of the framework within which we can take that material down when it's published, but also engage these very large global entities in taking responsibility for what's published on their sites. That is a very significant challenge where we're still coming up very short in terms of being able to protect the community on that front. So does that answer your question, Matteo?
Yes, thanks, Luke. There is another interesting question from Professor Nicolasquith, which says, it is important to have a national strategy on racism. What about national strategy on ableism, heterosexism? And if I can add, of course, we have talked about racism mainly in this panel discussion, but there are many other forms of hate: transphobia, homophobia, ableism, etc. So instead of, you know, considering all these forms of hate as part of the same ecosystem, we tend as a society to address them separately. So I would like to ask this question to Kristina. So how can we make sure that government responses address the issue of hatred as a whole without leaving behind some groups such as people living with disabilities, LGBTIQ+ communities, older people who are still victims of hate?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I thank the audience member who provided it, because it really does go to the heart of what we're talking about here. You know, there's a definitional issue that I touched on earlier that we need to make clear what we define as hate speech, and we also need to make clear, you know, who we would be seeking to support or protect with any legislation, campaigns, or initiatives. And I think it's also right to observe that some of these groups are, while they might start out with a particular view about a particular race, you know, will be willing to transfer that hatred towards whatever is convenient, whether it's a religion or a group that they perceive as getting, you know, quote unquote, more or advantage, you know, in society or from government. And so it's not just a racial issue for some hate groups. It is literally a convenience issue as to who can they target to most effectively get their messages across. And so I think a couple things. One, this is where some coordination bodies who can see the extent of the problem across the multiple areas in a way that individual groups can't, have an important role to play. Obviously, the Human Rights Commission is one of those bodies, but I'd also like to see federal entities like the Department of Home Affairs taking a leadership role on these issues in helping to define the problems to ensure that there are no groups being left behind. I think this is particularly important as the Department of Home Affairs has been, and its predecessor, the Immigration and Attorney Generals, were quite involved with the countering violent extremism, and and work with the states on this. I think we need to think about, as the ASIO Director General has highlighted, that right-wing extremist groups, far-right extremist groups, who are often just as indiscriminate in their targets as other terrorist organizations, are on the rise. And I would say that, and I talked earlier about moving, not just having a de-radicalization approach, but rather a prevention approach. And I think the Department of Home Affairs has a role to play here. I would also say that they acknowledge that diverse communities are playing their part in uniting with one another. And I think back to in 2017 when there was the push by the government to amend Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act to replace the words insult, offend, and humiliate with the term harass. I think we all remember that. And at that time, we had culturally and linguistically diverse groups from a wide variety of backgrounds, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and the wider Australian community come together to put forward a united opposition to the changes that the Labor opposition and the Senate crossbench successfully fought off in the Senate, that proposed change. And I would also note that we are seeing various members of the community come together in a united way when it comes to the government's proposed religious discrimination legislation. Now, I think there's merit in talking about a religious freedom or a religious discrimination bill. And I, along with Anthony Albanese, have met with a range of religious leaders across Australia, and they continue to express concerns about the legislation. What I find interesting is many of the concerns that they express are the same ones that I hear when I consult with community business groups or representing equality for gay and lesbian Australians. So it's interesting when you can find ways for these groups to come together. Now, often that gets mobilized around a particular piece of legislation or a particular incident. And, it is harder, I acknowledge, to have that happen in an ongoing and systematic fashion. But I think that's back to the very beginning. If we had a national database, if we had nationally consistent definitions, and we had a national picture of what was happening, supported by a campaign, which we have called it an anti-racism campaign, but I think it would be really the platform to become one about anti-hate across the board. I think the focus on an anti-racism campaign has particularly arisen out of what has happened during COVID-19 in relation specifically to Asian Australians. But it's an absolutely appropriate point to note that this is broader than just an anti-racism campaign. So I don't have a solution to how we maintain the ongoing coordination across these disparate groups who often have many tasks in front of them. But I think things like today's webinar, and all credit to to you, Matteo, and your team for putting it on, because I think it's an important part of maintaining that coordination.
Thank you, Kristina. I'll try to merge two questions from the audience, one from Widian and the other from Daria of the Islamophobia Register Australia. How can we make sure, Chin, this question would be for you, how can we make sure that communities are being heard, they feel comfortable in reporting, and also how can we make sure that community organizations have the appropriate resources and mechanisms to be supported in collecting data and supporting communities? So how can we, in looking at these from a bigger picture, how can we make sure communities are part of this system to address hate?
Well, Matthew, I've got this 4 Ps principle thing that I wave around as the important ways of getting things looked at. The first is obviously about principles, the values that we believe in, the things that sets the mission, as it were, statement. And then we have to have policies that are effective in taking care of all the issues in place. And obviously, then we need to have programs that work, and that has to be run and supported by communities. And then we need the practices. And we've seen some of the, for example, COVID-19 management issues that has fallen foul simply at the practice level. The right people dealing with communities in a particular way that didn't turn out well. And I like what a health officer said this, that like it or not, when in fact we think it's wasting time, money, and energy in dealing with communities for different backgrounds, but the reality is we are in a health crisis, and you've got to deal with communities in their culture, in their language, and ways they understand and they appreciate the issues we're talking about. And it's the same here. I mean, I do know from coming from my background to Chinese Australian, and I'm closely in touch with the community, that sense of frustration, that sense of distress of saying, is there a lot we can do? And then some would say, look, it's no point even talking about it because nothing is going to be done about this. And therein lies the issue we're talking about today. For example, how do you frame that hate definition? If we frame it too high and it becomes simply an area where crime is committed, then you'll lose out a lot of people who have been also injured along the way, who might match up to a threshold having a crime committed against them. Our question is, where do we start? And what do we want to measure and report? And how do we want to satisfy people's sense of justice when they've been treated badly? And that's an important discussion we need to have. And the question is, where do they go to? And I think it's important that, Matthew, that we involve communities. I mean, I'd love to have a place, one-stop shop in communities where you can turn to someone, call up, or a place where they get the support they need. I've sort of been putting that forward as a view that perhaps under COVID-19, we need that, a one-stop shop place where people call up, and it's a health issue they have because of they've been racially abused, they find support there and know where to go. But I think a lot of that work has been absorbed and done by community, and I've seen a lot of Chinese community leadership in this particular area, which is a great thing. The question for me is this: are they being properly supported? My view is that we can do more to support them.
Thank you very much, Chin. I would like, before concluding, to ask each of the speakers, starting from Luke, what do you think are the most important next steps we have to take to create a national database of hate crime data?
Well, look, I would actually go back to ultimately our strategic intent here. So creating a database, whether it's national or local, is never an end in itself. Obviously, it's a means to an end. And what is that end? And that comes to, I think, us having an agreed and universal understanding of what it is that we're trying to achieve here. Kristina's already called out and referenced the great pride that we should take in being one of the most multicultural and most successful multicultural communities on the planet. And certainly here in Victoria, we take great pride in our multicultural community and the diversity that that brings with us. But also, I would call out the lived experience of the First Nations over the past in excess of 200 years. And we should not forget that prejudice didn't emerge as people started arriving from boats other than from the United Kingdom. Prejudice has been with us in our nation since its inception. And the key piece for all of us is to understand that what we're seeking to do is build communities where everyone is allowed to fulfil their aspirations, and everyone has the opportunity to participate fully in community without fear of being called out as other, and without being characterised or held up for vilification on the basis that they're different from other sections of the community. And this brings me to the intent point. The key piece here is that calling others out as other dehumanises them. And it renders permissible a whole range of harmful conduct, which otherwise would be unpermissible. So the piece about prejudice-motivated crime and hate speech is that it is setting up the construct, it is setting up the framework within which people can be dehumanised. And once that is achieved, they can be isolated, they can be separated, they can be disenfranchised, their rights trampled, and their sense of belonging in our community completely destroyed. So the key point I would make about the reason why we need to have a national database around this is not so that a whole bunch of academics can engage in esoteric research. It is actually about pulling together a national understanding and appreciation of the drivers of harm in our community, and just how seriously those harms can undermine the standing of fellow human beings right across this great country of ours. So I would absolutely make that point. Let's not forget why we're trying to do this. Let's not forget that this is just it is so much more than being about a database that we can happily tap into on our computers. It is actually about making a difference for those who have lost their voice because there are other big mouths in our community who are shutting them down.
Absolutely. Thank you, Luke, for bringing us to the point that data is not just an end in itself, but it's important, well, actually for evaluating what police and government is doing, for underpinning policies, for advocacy and legislation change, for so many concrete reasons. Yes. Kristina, what do you think should be the next steps for you?
The first thing I want to acknowledge is that this is not the only part of public policy where we do not have a nationally consistent database. And I don't say that to minimize the need for one here. I say it to reflect upon the fact that federation, which I have a lot of, I am a federalist. Nonetheless, I have to acknowledge that federation sometimes does not assist us in our efforts to drive good public policy outcomes. And so I reflect, for example, some work I did 2 years ago around stillbirth, where we did not have nationally consistent definitions, where we did not have and still do not have a national database that researchers can easily tap into, where we do not have a national plan or coordination to drive down the rates of stillbirth, or anything that would approach a national approach. So I only make that point to acknowledge that while there is a challenge here, it is not a challenge that you have faced, that you face alone. And it is a challenge that has been overcome. You know, part of what we did in terms of stillbirth, and I'm not suggesting that we need a Senate inquiry or a national inquiry, but at the same time, that really did help to have a Senate inquiry examine the issue and make recommendations to government. So I would say that is something to contemplate, some kind of federal level inquiry. There are multiple committees at a federal level that might have a capacity or an interest in this, so whether it's the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Law Enforcement or a Senate committee, or I'm sure there are others in both the House and the Senate structure. So I think that's one possible step forward. Another thing that we worked on in terms of stillbirth was to, and it sounds as if what Luke and Victoria are doing are a long way towards this, is essentially in the Victorian health system, they decided to set one up themselves, and to really they took a decision that if they could make a statewide collection of data consistent and useful in Victoria in relation to stillbirth, given the complexities of the Victorian health system, there was a view that then it could work anywhere in Australia or work on a national level in Australia. And, you know, they did it, they implemented it, and in fact, they got some really amazing outcomes by collecting data on, you know, things like the ethnicity of a birth mother, which actually does, we don't know why, but does seem to affect the rates of stillbirth. And by using that data, they were actually able to take the high rates of stillbirth for women of Southeast Asian backgrounds and drive them down to zero in the last 2 weeks of pregnancy. And so I make that observation to say sometimes it helps if you roll something out and trial it on a statewide basis to show that it can work on a broader basis. And so where something is working well at a state level, then using that as a template to push for a national platform. I think the other thing to give some thought to is where a national database sits most appropriately, whether it would sit with ABS, whether it would sit with the Human Rights Commission, whether it would sit in Attorney General's Department, you know, or some other body that might do it. As I said, I do think the Department of Home Affairs has a responsibility here. I don't know that they have the responsibility to be the data collector, but I certainly think they would have a responsibility in terms of using that data to inform public education, countering violent extremism, tackling hate speech, and national education and programs and campaigns. The other thing I would like to acknowledge is Luke's leadership here today, alongside Chin's. Both of them, I think, we're very fortunate to have within our ecosystem and providing leadership, not just in their particular roles, but their words and their leadership emanate out of beyond just the broad job descriptions that they have. And Luke's quite eloquent summation I would like to associate myself with. And if I could add to it from a federal perspective, one last responsibility I think that we have, that this data, by the way, I think would help inform quite well, is the extent to which a lack of opportunity, a lack of employment or underemployment, a lack of education and training, contributes to particularly young people's disengagement from society and openness to hearing these messages and responding to them, and opening themselves up to propaganda and radicalization. And you know, that is a responsibility I think only a federal government can really take on to, you know, examine that relationship. I think academics, sorry, I shouldn't say that only federal government can take it on. I mean, only a federal government can collect the data that helps inform that and helps lead the response to it, the policy responses. But I think that is well informed by the academic researchers and the community organizations that are involved here today and involved across Australia. So I will leave it there because I'm been quite inspired myself. I've made copious notes, and I want to thank my fellow panelists as well as all of you who've contributed really thoughtful questions.
Thank you, Kristina. Lots of food for thoughts, and really thank you for you know, helping us to think about the way forward. You made very clear and achievable, I think, in my view, suggestions. Chin, where do we take this? Where do we go? How will the Australian Human Rights Commission lead us?
Lots of places, Matteo. But I do want to echo what Kristina has said. I'm indeed privileged that today to have the wonderful panel members, and I've known Luke for a while now, and then I've been following Kristina and the things she stands for, the kind of kindred spirit and knowing and talking about the things that we were shared in common about what the emphasis and priorities are. So I appreciate it, and thank you very much for your very clear consensus about supporting an important area. But following up from what Luke has said, I just want to clarify that for me, I'm not a data person. I was a lawyer before. I'm more empirical in some of the things I do, but getting into this job, I felt it was important to have evidence-based information to support what we do in government and outside government, to have clarity about what we're talking about. The big question that's been asked, you know, that of me all the time from anyone is Australia become more racist? How do you measure that? You can take a finger, you know, and put it in your mouth and then, you know, dig it up, put it up to the air and get a wind, a feel and say, I think we have. But how do we measure that? And how do we know for sure that we have become worse? And where are the areas that we become worse? And what the aspect of create, you know, to collude to make that happen? And then important information for me anyway, in terms of where I am as a policymaker about understanding the depth of those issues. But racism is not a policy issue. It's not like defense, you know, it's not like border protection. It's a community problem. It's a community issue. And I think we need to put it and sit it in the correct place and not just turn to police and say, what are you doing about this? If police is the only authority on hate crimes, we're in trouble, because I don't think that's where it ends or stops. You know, the Brendan Tarrant of this world doesn't come to police attention until he created such horrendous, you know, murder, right? The question is, in that space where the Tarrant of this world sits in our community, what are we doing, and how do we pick that up, and how do we support communities to ensure that that doesn't happen into the future? And that is an important area. The other aspect you mentioned is this about the ecosystem of hate. I agree, no country can prevail if it lets hate run in its culture. So we got to collectively attack that as well. So this ecosystem of hate needs to be looked through across all attributes of hate, you know, that we have in a human rights perspective. But then, of course, we got to be realistic that the spirit of hate is the same, but then it is expressed in different ways. It's like a garden with different trees and different needs. And so the way it's expressed in race area is a bit different, even though it's the same in some areas in the hate, you know, the hate perspective. And we need to be able to be smart and sophisticated. And I'm dealing now with right-wing activists who are far more resourced and who are smarter than we are and more sophisticated in using all sorts of technology and means in the media capacity to get the message across. And we should be doing a better job in being able to do that. But this is where it's working in conjunction with government, with the police, to get it right. For example, in the right-wing extremism area, for example, Asia has come out, but Asia deals with a very extreme level, right? And the question for me is this: where is the crossover that concerns them? At what point do we have a role to play? And I don't think we're supported enough to do that job of making sure that we make sure that our young people in particular do not cross over. And that is a social work. That is a community work. And for me, this is where the challenge of getting it right. Where do I go with this particular project? I'm very keen to develop an internal capacity when I get enough support in terms of funding and getting enough staffing to put together a team to look at a kind of a paper, right, exploring this issue and come up, and obviously working with people like yourself about saying, these are some of the discussion issues we think we need to have about getting to another point. Where is my long-term? perspective about where I would like to see things, the outcome. I'd like to see an institute of some form at a higher level supported by government in conjunction with the private sector that allows information to be collected, federally, and that we can use and share across. So that's my ultimate objective as well. That might be music to your ear, but it's still a long way away. And I do wish that we can progress this with your support, with obviously the panel members who are sitting there and saying, how can we do this together? So I look forward to engaging with communities into the future and saying, let's get this to work. Let's have something that we can use, make productive use of the discussions that we are having now. But let's keep the conversation going. Let's keep the discussion and dialogue and discourse going, because it's an important element of justifying the things we need to see in terms of the outcome that we want to produce. So thank you for your work, Matteo, and your team and the things you've done. We've had a long session before in the last 2 weeks. Obviously, you're not tired of me, and I obviously would relish the opportunity to continue working with you to achieve some of the common purpose we've got. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chin, and thank you, Kristina, and thank you, Luke, and thank you to the audience. I've seen many names of many friends who are now audience, but they will be in the future panelists, and they are all important stakeholders from community organizations and other government organizations, which we need to still continue to talk together. I think today's panel was great. It gave a lot of insights, and it's an important commitment that we all do to continue to work on this topic now and in the future. So thank you again to all of you, and I hope I'll see you very soon in other events and roundtables on this topic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Luke, take care.
Bye.
Stay safe.
Bye. Take care.